Right, the summit meetings between the superpowers between the dates 1985 and 1991. There are a few of them, but they're not actually ridiculously complicated. I suggest what you do is get out your, I don't know what you call these guys, these little paper things that you stick your fingers in and you play with like that. As you can see on the outside, we have the dates of various summits, and inside we have a few more details, and then as you fold the flap up, more specific details of various events. Right, that looks really sad, I know, and it's quite it is quite sad, but you know what? It's a really, really, really good way of revising. It's a bit of fun to make, and as you're writing it and planning it, you're making links and it sits in your pocket. You just pull it out in a quiet moment when none of your mates are watching to make fun of you, and you can revise that way. Thank you to Emilio for that one. It's really good. So, to go over the content that needs to be included in that, the first thing you need to be aware of is Gorbachev. You need to know that Gorbachev is a key reason why there are summit meetings between the superpowers between those dates 85 and 91. Gorbachev came to power in Russia in 1985. He was a very new type of leader. He was very young, and he had some very different views. Russia also faced some big problems at the time, and Gorbachev had some very novel solutions to those problems. One of the first things Gorbachev did when he came to power was abandon the Brezhnev doctrine that had caused so many problems throughout the 60s for the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev doctrine was a huge drain on Soviet resources, and as a consequence of that, the standard of living for Russians was dropping. And when the standard of living drops, people become unhappier, and the level of unrest or opposition to the communist state grows. Now, Gorbachev wanted to modernise communism, not get rid of it. He's definitely still a communist. Now, he hoped to bring about these changes and modernise Russia in three ways. The first of which of his two policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost meaning openness, and perestroika restructuring. Always get those two mixed up. Now, the second thing he wanted to do was to end the arms race. And he signed various arms agreements, which are the ones on your thing. And thirdly, he stopped Soviet interference in Eastern Europe, particularly in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Warsaw Pact countries. And as a consequence of that, you get the rise of Solidarity, or Solidarność, in Poland under Lech Walesa. Very, very interesting what goes on there. It's not actually a part of the course that we study here, but it is really quite interesting to learn about. Maybe I think that because I grew up through it. Now, the first key summit of this period is the 1985 Geneva Summit. Geneva, a neutral country, good meeting ground for two countries that aren't getting on very well. They met for 2 days in November 1985. It was Reagan and Gorbachev, and at the end of it, they spoke about the world becoming a safer place. What they actually found was they really quite liked each other, and they could talk and try and sort things out amicably, in a friendly way. Now, they agreed to speed up arms reduction talks, they agreed to work together to abolish chemical weapons, and they agreed to be more active in the area of human rights. And they promised to meet up soon, and they did so. They did so in the second summit, which was 1986 in Iceland. Now, I suggest you call it the Iceland Summit because the place they met was called Reykjavik, and that's a little bit tricky to spell. R-E-Y-K-J-A-V-I-K. Iceland. Now, unfortunately, now you've made all that effort to learn how to spell Reykjavik, nothing happened. They basically argued because Reagan refused to give up on SDI, and that was the one thing that was really freaking Russia out. All these missiles in space with laser beams and stuff. It's all very Star Wars. Now, also they broke down on talks about anti-ballistic missile treaty. They disagreed. So they left, and that's a bit of a shame. Nothing was really agreed. However, they did meet up again in 1987 at the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now here they did agree something, and it was very, very, very positive. It's a massive breakthrough in superpower relations. Now, what they agreed to do was to eliminate all nuclear and conventional ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles, intermediate-range missiles. And by the deadline of this treaty, which was in June 1991, over 2,500 nuclear weapons had been dismantled. 846 by the USA, and the rest, 1,846, by the Soviet Union. Now, what they also agreed was that actually each side could send inspectors to the other people to make sure they weren't cheating. And that's a really quite a big step for these countries, to allow militaries from the opponent's country to come and visit and watch your military destroy their weapons. This is a really important period of time because it really marks a major improvement in relations and trust in each other. So long gone are those days of suspicion in the early stages of the Cold War, and even the new freeze under Reagan. Now, the fourth summit was the final summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, because Reagan then stepped down and was replaced by George Bush. It was in Moscow in 1988. Now, you have to realise that at this time, a thing called Gorby Mania was sweeping the West. Gorbachev was the 1980s equivalent of Justin Bieber. All right. For some reason, everyone in the West just absolutely loved him, because for the first time, he was a communist leader that wanted to be friends with the West and improve relations. So Gorby Mania swept Europe. I love the phrase Gorby Mania. It always makes me chuckle. Now, at the Moscow summit, what was agreed was that more arms control talks would take place, and troop reductions in Europe would take place by the next year, 1989. And Gorbachev promised to withdraw from Afghanistan, which was very, very, very important. Now, the fifth summit, to be aware of, was the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, CFE, Conventional Forces Europe Treaty. Signed in 1990 by NATO and Warsaw Pact countries. And what it did was it agreed to reduce the number of non-nuclear weapons. So that's tanks, aircraft, missiles, that sort of thing. But it's not about strategic arms. But each side is basically reducing the number of troops they have, and the consequence of that is reduced tension. Now, a new president came in America. His name was George Bush. That's George Bush Sr. And in 1989, George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev met at Malta, and together they announced the end of the Cold War. It was all finished. Now, some courses finished there. I always think it's nice to just finish the story off so we know exactly what's going on. Now, in 1990 to 91, there was a final set of talks. They are the START talks. And this was at Washington, held in Washington in 1990. Bush and Gorbachev discussed strategic arms limitation, and they signed the Treaty for the Reduction and Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. Okay, don't learn that. It will take you forever. Call it START 1. Make sure you write that in capitals, S-T-A-R-T 1. In 1991. Now, START basically reduced strategic warheads by 25 to 35%. And actually, interestingly, it was Gorbachev and Bush signed it with pens made from scrap missiles. And that really is the end of those summit meetings between the superpowers. They can be a little bit confusing, but there's only really 5 or 6 to learn. Okay, good luck with that.